The others, he's the only governor who previously held the office. The founder of the Republican Party of American Samoa, he was the territory's first governor, appointed in 1956. He was elected to the governorship in 1978, re-elected in 1980, but was prohibited by law from running another consecutive term. The governor, who was born in Pongo Pongo, American Samoa, received degrees from Georgetown University. He has 13 children.
Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, will address the National Press Club in Washington. She will discuss a variety of global environmental concerns. Today on C-SPAN, beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific Time.
From the nation's capital, you're watching C-SPAN. Coming up next, coverage of a forum focusing on the theme, The Spread of Democracy Around the World. The forum was sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy, and the panel discussion will air looks at Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
Good morning. I'm Carl Gershman, the President of the National Endowment for Democracy, and I want to welcome everyone to our second World Conference on Democracy. Before we begin and before I introduce Congressman Dante Fascell for his welcoming remarks, I want to dispense with a few procedural matters. We have a large program and it should be an exciting conference, but we are deficient in a couple of areas. One is space and the other is time. More people expressed a desire to attend some of our sessions than we have room for, and therefore to accommodate as many people as possible, we have urged people in the back, we want to urge people in the back to fill up any available space in the front and center of the room, and even if need be, if we have more visitors who come during the session, there is a row of chairs actually behind this dais. And we're also urging speakers at other sessions who are not speaking at the current session to join members of the endowment board in vacant chairs here on the dais. Regarding time, we have asked each of our speakers to limit his or her remarks to 10 minutes. We will try to enforce this rule as strictly as we can, so that there will be time for questions and comments from the floor. We would like to accommodate everybody who has a question or comment. This may be impossible, and if need be, we will give preference to our visitors from abroad who have traveled so far to be with us. Let me ask that comments be as brief as possible and that they not exceed 3 minutes. And let me also remind everyone that we have simultaneous English-Spanish translation, which you can listen to by using the headsets on your chair. Spanish is on channel 3. I have 3 changes to announce in the program that you received in the mail. Ricardo Bofill of the Cuban Committee on Human Rights will be speaking at lunch in place of Armando Valladares. Gabriel Murillo, the chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Los Andes in Colombia, will be speaking at the Latin American panel this afternoon in place of Hernando de Soto. And we regret that Octavio Paz will not be able to be with us tomorrow morning. Otherwise, the program is the same, and updated programs are available at the registration tables outside. Also, you will note that literature about the endowment and its core institutes, the Free Trade Union Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the National Democratic and National Republican Institutes for International Affairs, is also available on the display tables outside. Our theme for this conference is the Democratic Revolution, which is an appropriate theme for a conference in this city on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the inauguration of George Washington as President of the United States. The Democratic Revolution is arguably the most important and certainly the most hopeful global phenomenon of the past decade. It has swept over almost all of Latin America. Its impact can be felt in the Philippines, South Korea, Pakistan, and elsewhere in Asia. It is shaking the communist world to its very foundations, most notably in the Soviet Union, Poland, and Hungary, and now most dramatically in China, the world's most populous country. And even where it has been set back, as in South Africa, Burma, Haiti, the movements that have been crushed or thwarted are actually further evidence of the universality of the democratic quest. And even though we are aware that countries where democracy has triumphed face a difficult future, as in Peru or Brazil or Argentina, this does not alter our confidence in the long-term prospects for democratic advance. Today and tomorrow we will have an opportunity to examine this phenomenon with some of the key participants in the democratic struggle, and also with some writers who have thought most deeply about it. We hope that these discussions will not only help us to understand better the prospects for democracy in different parts of the world and the obstacles, both internal and external, that might inhibit its advance. We also hope that it will help draw together people who are pursuing democratic objectives in countries and contexts that are vastly diverse, and that each movement will benefit from such interaction. Not least, we hope that these discussions will enable the National Endowment for Democracy to become even more effective in assisting the growth of democracy in the world. It is my honor now to introduce Congressman Dante Fascell. As chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, he is our host for these 2 days, and for this we are deeply grateful. He is also a member of the Endowment's board. I could give a very long introduction about Congressman Fascell, but I will say only this. The National Endowment for Democracy would not exist were it not for him. It is he who took this idea for an institution to promote democracy in the world and made it into a reality through the legislative process. It took almost 2 decades to accomplish this, but he created something which can have an impact for good far beyond our shores and for a very long time to come. I'm happy to present Congressman Fascell.
Carl, ladies and gentlemen, Carl's much too generous. Is this thing on? Oh. I can yell without it. I am honored by the generosity of his introduction, but I'm quick to point out that there were many people long before me and many people long after me who have been involved in the struggle for freedom. I'm just delighted to have had an opportunity as a member of Congress to be part of that struggle. As I see all of you out there, I can't help but think what a great day this is, not only for the National Endowment for Democracy, but just for mankind in a very general sense, all men and women everywhere. Just a short time ago, I don't think a meeting like this was ever contemplated or even possible. And yet, we all wondered, I'm sure, at some place and in some dark corner, whether or not only we, but other people would ever see the light of day, translated into the dignity of the individual, the right to think, the right to be free, the right to choose, the right to have a future. And the struggle goes far beyond simply a contest of ideologies. It might even be something inherent in human nature, I'm not sure. I'll leave that to you experts, either in the medical field or in the political field. I have never understood violence in the element. I have never understood man's inhumanity to man. I have never understood why it was essential to put every human brain in the same little square black box. And that's the only way to describe what is happening. And yet every day around the world we read of horrible acts of man, the consequences of it. And so we take heart today that there is a breeze, if you will, that is circumnavigating the globe. And we're all heartened by that. The truth of the matter is, however, that while we here are delighted to welcome you to Washington, and particularly to this room, Foreign Affairs Committee room, and we feel like we've played a small part in the struggle as a National Endowment for Democracy, the truth of the matter is that we are honored and privileged that you are here, because you give us the strength, you give us the courage, you give us the picture that the world must see and understand if we're to make any kind of progress. It's because of your willingness to make the commitment, the devotion, your dedication, that you're here and that others in many, many places share the same opportunity that you do. So this conference today is a great event. It coalesces all of the struggles of all the people for those basic human values for which you have struggled so long. I say that you can't have a future economically or politically or socially unless you treat your fellow man properly and with dignity. And that's what our struggle has been all about, freedom and democracy. So we here at the National Endowment of Democracy are proud to be part of the struggle which you have undertaken so gallantly. We wish you well. We believe this conference is of the utmost importance in having the opportunity not only to see each other, exchange ideas, but give hope and courage to the many who must follow you.
Thank you, Dante. Congressman Fasell is going to be with us for a good part of the conference, but he's got an appointment outside of the building now, I think the State Department or the White House?
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State. And that takes certainly one of the things that takes precedence now, and so we thank you, Dante. And
well, he's very excited about the National Endowment for Democracy and our struggle, and we want to keep him very enthusiastic.
Thank you, Dante. I think since everyone is pretty much in place, we can just go, we're going to have to shift seats around for some of the other panels, but I think we can now go straight into the panel on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And the chairman of this morning's session is John Richardson, who is formerly the chairman of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. John.
Thank you, Carl. The first panel, as you see in your schedule, is entitled The Soviet Bloc, which is already an anachronism. The Soviet bloc was the Soviet bloc but it is much less so than it was. And this morning we will hear from some of those who are having and continue to have a major influence on this evolution. I first want to introduce Jacek Kuron, a key advisor to Solidarity in Poland. You will hear more about him tomorrow, but you already know. As you know, he's been a leading advocate of the new opening toward democratic pluralism, which was embodied in last month's historic agreement between Solidarity and the Polish government. Mr. Kuron.
Niedawno w Polsce, w moim kraju, odbywały się rozmowy niezależnej opozycji skupionej wokół Solidarności z władzą.
Recently in Poland, in my country, talks were held between opposition united around solidarity and the authorities.
Te rozmowy były transmitowane przez telewizję, rozmawialiśmy z ludźmi władzy i poszliśmy tam w garniturach. W związku z tym bardzo wielu naszych przyjaciół miało nam za złe, żeśmy tam w garniturach przyszli, któreśmy sobie pożyczyli.
Those talks were transmitted by television and we talked to the authorities. So many of us donned suits to go there and many of our friends criticized us for coming in suits and ties.
W związku z tym ja dzisiaj przyszedłem bez garnituru i znowu popełniłem faux pas, za co państwa bardzo przepraszam.
So today I came without a suit and again I was wrong and I apologize for it.
No ale sam ten fakt, że w kraju komunistycznym spotkali się ludzie władzy z opozycją antysystemową, że ta opozycja, nie po to, aby ta opozycja systemowa straciła swoją tożsamość, przyłączyła się do władzy, ale po to, aby z nią pertraktować jak z niezależną siłą.
The very fact that in a totalitarian communist country, the authorities met halfway with anti-systemic opposition, not in order not to co-opt this opposition, but to negotiate with the opposition as autonomous force is of primary importance.
Jest to fakt niezwykły i w związku z tym jakby zaprzeczający totalitaryzmowi.
It's a very unusual fact and in a way it's a fact denying totalitarism.
Bo totalitaryzm jest to próba centralnego sterowania całym życiem społecznym.
Totalitarism is an attempt to centrally command all social life.
Opiera się na monopolu centralnego ośrodka władzy na organizowanie się.
It's based on the monopoly of the power center to organize any activities.
To znaczy sytuacja jest taka, że kiedy obywatele próbowaliby się spotkać i porozumieć w sprawie na przykład naprawy dachu w swoim bloku, to już by działali przeciw władzy i byli opozycjonistami samym tym faktem.
The monopoly is so total that if citizens gather freely and discuss freely a matter such simple as roof repairs on a block of flats, this is already a challenge to the central authority.
I to jest monopol organizacji. Następnym istotnym monopolem jest monopol informacji.
This is a monopoly of organization, but the next most important monopoly is the monopoly on information.
To znaczy, że każde słowo drukowane, nie mówiąc już o innych środkach masowego przekazu, jest sterowane przez centralny ośrodek władzy.
Meaning that every printed word, not to mention the electronic media, every printed word is centrally steered by central authority.
I co z tych dwóch monopoli wynika? Jest jeszcze monopol decyzji, to znaczy, że wszelkie decyzje muszą zapadać w centralnym ośrodku władzy.
Therefore, that leads to a monopoly of decision, meaning that all decisions are made by central authority.
Nie muszę tłumaczyć, że to jest niemożliwe, że takiego programu się nie da zrealizować, ale kiedy się go próbuje z olbrzymią siłą realizować, to destruuje się całe życie społeczne, dobra materialne, kulturę, wszystko.
It's almost superficial to say that such an ideal cannot be implemented, but any attempt of implementing it destroys social, economic, political life.
Otóż w sytuacji, w której nagle pojawia się w rozmowach z władzą zorganizowana siła opozycji, ludzie występująca w telewizji, bez cenzury, niezależnie prezentująca swoje stanowisko, można by powiedzieć, że oto w tym miejscu został przezwyciężony, złamany te trzy monopole i tym samym system totalitarny.
Therefore, if organized opposition enters negotiation with the authorities, negotiations which are uncensorably transmitted by television, relied to every household, one can say that totalitarianism has been broken since all those three monopolies were broken.
Ale oczywiście nie w tym momencie to się zaczęło.
But of course, that was not the beginning.
Tym, co w sposób radykalny złamało totalitaryzm w naszym kraju, były generalne strajki w 1980 roku, które ustanowiły Solidarność, wielki związek zawodowy i ruch społeczny niezależny, który władza musiała uznać.
The real breakthrough took place already in 1980, when a massive wave of strikes led to establishing of Solidarity, an independent union, which had to be recognized and was recognized by the central government.
W tym momencie system totalitarny w Polsce został rzeczywiście złamany.
At this particular moment, the totalitarian system in Poland was broken.
W owym czasie napisałem artykuł, który nazywał się "Co dalej?", w którym pisałem o tym, co się zdarzyło w kategorii, opisywałem to przy pomocy porównania z ruchem pociągów.
At that time I wrote an essay under a headline, What Next?, in which I compared the political situation in Poland with movement of trains.
Otóż gdyby w ruchu pociągów, który jak wiadomo jest sterowany centralnie, wprowadzić zasadę, że co 10. pociąg jest samorządny i niezależny, to znaczy jego czas wyruszenia, dojazdu, miejsca postoju i kierunki ustalali niezależnie i samorządnie pasażerowie z załogą, to trzeba by było albo zmienić zasadę budowania rozkładu jazdy, albo nastąpiłaby seria katastrof.
A railroad scheduled in which every 10th train would be independent and self-governing by an accord between the conductor and the passengers would lead to a situation in which either the principle on which the schedule of the whole railroad is built would be changed, or to a series of catastrophes.
Taka była właśnie sytuacja w Polsce, ponieważ w ramach systemu centralnie sterowanego powstał zupełnie niezależny, samorządny, potężny ruch skupiający ponad połowę dorosłych mieszkańców naszego kraju.
And that was the situation in Poland at that time, since within a totalitarian system, a massive movement into which over half of all population belonged was created.
No i ponieważ ludzie władzy, aparat, ci, którzy są rzeczywistymi władcami w systemie totalitarnym, systemu pod żadnym pozorem w tej sytuacji zmieniać nie chcieli, to oczywiście musiała przyjść katastrofa i ona przyszła 13 grudnia 1981 roku.
Since the nomenclatura, the apparatus of power, did not want to make necessary structural changes, catastrophe was inevitable, and it came on December 13, 1981, as imposition of martial law.
Został ogłoszony stan wojenny, na ulicę wyjechały czołgi, zniesiono obowiązywanie wszelkich praw, społeczeństwo podporządkowano dyktaturze wojskowej, wojskowo-policyjnej.
The tanks rolled into the streets, all laws were suspended, the population was terrorized and was submitted to a military and police dictatorship.
Można by powiedzieć, no skoro ja mówię, że w sierpniu 80 roku i w następnych miesiącach został w Polsce zlikwidowany system totalitarny przez wielki ruch ludowy, no to 13 grudnia ten totalitaryzm z powrotem wrócił. Otóż nie.
One could say that if totalitarianism was broken in Poland in 1980 by this massive popular movement, the imposition of martial law restored totalitarianism. No, this is not my opinion.
Można powiedzieć, że to jest przykład na to, że procesów społecznych nie można cofać.
It's an example, one could say, that certain social processes are irreversible.
Bowiem tak jak wybuch Solidarności, to powstanie Solidarności potężne było zaprzeczeniem totalitaryzmu, tak i jego zaprzeczeniem, tylko zupełnie innym, był stan wojenny 13 grudnia ogłoszony.
The explosion of solidarity was a denial of totalitarianism, but also this martial law was a denial of totalitarianism.
Mianowicie, jak powiedziałem, system totalitarny opiera się na 3 monopolach organizacji, informacji, decyzji. I im doskonalsze są te monopole, tym bardziej ukryty jest jego charakter. Zupełnie.
Since a totalitarian system is based on those 3 monopolies of information, organization and decision, the more perfect the system, the better camouflaged it is. It becomes nearly invisible.
Na przykład w moim kraju istniał parlament, wielopartyjność, wiele różnych gazet i w ogóle mogło wyglądać z zewnątrz, jakby to był parlamentarny, wolny kraj.
For instance, in my country, a parliament existed, a multi-party system existed, a number of newspapers appeared, and one could see, or one could have an illusion that this is a normal parliamentary democracy.
Przypominam, polega to na tym, że jak tak każda organizacja i jej działanie, tak każda informacja jest zaplanowana w centralnym ośrodku, to może ona mówić cokolwiek ci w centrali chcą.
If any information and any movement, any action is centrally planned, those planners can say whatever they please.
Otóż 13 grudnia, tak jak w sierpniu żeśmy złamali w 80 roku tą zasadę powstaniem ludowym, takim pokojowym, tak 13 grudnia oni też zerwali z tą zasadą. Obnażyli nagą przemoc. Powiedzieli, występujemy siłą przeciw społeczeństwu.
So as in August of 1980, the peaceful popular uprising has broken this illusion. This illusion was broken a second time by the authorities themselves by declaring martial law and telling everybody, we will use a naked force. We will suppress the society with a naked force.
A ponieważ w systemie totalnym ludzie uczestniczą wszyscy, bo taka jest struktura społeczna, więc opiera się on na pewnej umowie społecznej. Tą umowę społeczną wypowiedzieliśmy w sierpniu, a oni ją złamali 13 grudnia.
And since in a totalitarian system, every person, every member of a society is in some measure involved, it creates a certain social compact. We denounced this compact in August of 1980, but they have broken this compact in December of 1981.
I powstała w ten sposób dyktatura oparta tylko na sile, która jest samodestruktywna w sposób jedyny w swoim rodzaju. Ona sama siebie musi zniszczyć.
Thus a dictatorship based uniquely on force was created, but such a dictatorship is self-destructive.
Władza miała do wyboru albo utrzymać tą dyktaturę i tym samym niszczyć wszystko, jako że gospodarkę taka dyktatura, choć totalitaryzm niszczy gospodarkę, ale taka dyktatura, która jest dyktaturą ludzi posiadających przemoc, czyli dyletantów w gospodarce, niszczy ją natychmiast i kompletnie. Więc albo to utrzymać, albo zmienić kierunek i znaleźć jakiś sposób porozumienia z społeczeństwem, a więc wycofać się z dyktatury.
The authorities had two options. One option was to maintain such a dictatorship which even more quickly than ordinary totalitarianism destroys everything, including the economy, or to withdraw from that form of dictatorship.
I w rezultacie po różnych próbach zdecydowała się na porozumienie ze społeczeństwem, na porozumienie z opozycją.
And finally, after a number of attempts of different solutions, the authorities decided that a certain agreement with the society is possible by making agreement with the opposition.
I tak doszliśmy do okrągłego stołu, przy którym ustalaliśmy taki porządek, aby istniały warunki dla organizowania się społeczeństwa i dla stopniowego przechodzenia z systemu totalitarnego do demokracji.
And thus conditions were created for round-table negotiations aimed at allowing the society to self-organize and gradual movement towards democracy.
A więc krótko mówiąc, te rozmowy okrągłego stołu były dalszym ciągiem wielkiego ruchu społecznego z sierpnia 80 roku, wielkiego ruchu oporu społecznego w czasie stanu wojennego, dalszym ciągiem procesu walki społeczeństwa polskiego o demokrację.
In other words, the round-table talks were a certain stage of a constant struggle of Polish people for democracy, previous stages being the enormous social activity in the legal days of Solidarity, and then enormous clandestine resistance during the days of martial law.
Płynie z tego przede wszystkim taka oto ważka nauka, że nie jest tak, aby totalitaryzm, jak nam wielu ludzi mówiło, mógł być złamany tylko z zewnątrz, tak jak podawano przykład Niemiec hitlerowskich i wojny, że nie ma sił wewnętrznych, że musi być złamany z zewnątrz.
The most important lesson of all these is perhaps that a certain assumption that totalitarianism can be broken only from the outside, since there are no internal forces capable of breaking totalitarian system, that this assumption is false.
Może być totalitaryzm, okazało się, przezwyciężony z wewnątrz przez samoorganizujące się społeczeństwo.
Self-organizing society can overcome totalitarianism from within.
Można zapytać, jak można się samoorganizować w systemie totalitarnym?
How you can self-organize under a totalitarian system?
I oczywiście, żeby na to pytanie odpowiedzieć, trzeba powiedzieć jasno, że również nie w sierpniu 80 roku ten ruch się zaczął, ruch organizowania się społeczeństwa.
To answer this question, I have to say that this movement of self-organizing of the society did not begin in August of 1980.
Zaczynaliśmy wiele lat wcześniej.
We began many years before.
I jak dziś spojrzę na to, cośmy wtedy robili, co było odbierane jako rewolucja, to aż mnie ogarnia zdziwienie.
Looking back at those years, at something which was perceived as revolution, I look back in astonishment.
Bo tu chodziło o to, żeby po prostu ze sobą rozmawiać, żeby mówić głośno, żeby czytać i pożyczać książki, żeby zbierać pieniądze i pomagać ludziom, którzy pomocy potrzebują. Najprostsze, ludzkie, proste, zwyczajne gesty.
It was so simple then. What we wanted was to read books, to talk to each other, to collect money for people needing help. Very simple, the simplest human actions.
I wokół nich można organizować się, a to jest właśnie jakby bomba podłożona pod totalitaryzm.
And one can organize a society around those simple actions and goals. And this very fact is like a time bomb under totalitarianism.
Zdaje się, że jeszcze jedna nauka płynie z naszego doświadczenia. Nauka, która mieści się w takim oto problemie, które nam stawiają nasi przyjaciele liczni, opozycjoniści w Polsce. Mówią, po co tam idziecie rozmawiać? Przecież trzeba było gromadzić gniew, organizować ludzi i prędzej czy później byśmy ich obalili.
There is one more lesson from this evolution. Many of our friends, members of the opposition in Poland, ask us, Why did you go to those roundtable negotiations? Wouldn't it be better to organize people, to increase the potential for social explosion which would wipe out the system?
My odpowiadamy nie. Nie chcemy obalać tego porządku przemocą.
We say no. We don't want to destroy the system by force.
I można to uzasadniać w różny sposób.
Several explanations, several reasons for it can be given.
Ale wydaje mi się, że najważniejszy jest taki oto, że kiedy burzy się że totalitaryzm jest systemem wymyślonym i na tym polega tragedia. Wymyślono system i próbowano go stosować, a życie społeczne tego nie znosi, więc musi obumierać wokół tego obcego ciała.
The simplest reason is that totalitarianism is a system artificially created, artificially designed, so to speak. And such a system destroys all life around itself.
A jeśli się zburzy jakikolwiek porządek, to przecież już się nie sprowadzi innego z innych krajów, ani z dalekiej przeszłości. Trzeba wymyślić system i w związku z tym po takiej rewolucji przemocą zawsze musi przyjść system wymyślony, a z nim razem całe zło i zniewolenie.
And if you destroy a political system, you cannot bring over another system from the past, or you cannot import another system from abroad. You have to create a new system, but that new system would be also a system artificially constructed, and such a system would bring back all defaults of the old system.
I z tego płynie taka oto nauka, że droga do demokracji musi być procesem.
The lesson, therefore, is that the road to democracy has to be a process.
Procesem stopniowych przemian, stopniowego budowania instytucji demokratycznych, bo przecież
a process of gradual evolution, of gradual building of democratic institutions.
I chociaż to można powiedzieć jest rewolucja w tym sensie, że przechodzimy radykalnie od systemu totalitarnego do demokracji.
It is a revolution in this sense that we radically change the system. We go from totalitarianism to democracy.
To jeśli ma to być droga do demokracji, jeśli ma to być rewolucja demokratyczna, to musi ona się dokonywać w stopniowym procesie, a więc przez ewolucję.
If it should be a road to democracy, if it should be a democratic revolution, it must be done in a gradual process.
Thank you, Mr. Couron, for illuminating a struggle in which you have played such a key role. And thank you also, Mr. Kalabinski, for that excellent translation. Now we have another hero of this struggle, Vladimir Bukovsky, who was imprisoned and exiled in the Soviet Union for his dissent in the area of psychiatric abuse and released in 1976 following a global campaign on his behalf. Mr. Bukovski is a member of the board of the Center for Democracy in the USSR and an endowment grantee. Mr. Bukovski.
Thank you, John. I think as it is so usual in our world, we have a good news and a bad news. They always travel together. The good news, as we all know, is that the Soviet regime went bankrupt. That is probably the best news we've got in this century. Suddenly, as a result of it, the Soviets have to pull out from all these areas which they tried to conquer for communism for so many years. We suddenly hear about Vietnamese troops being withdrawn from Cambodia. We suddenly hear about the Cuban troops being withdrawn from Angola. We hear all kind of good news about the Third World. What was previously dangerous in the way of people's attempt to change their systems from oppressive and dictatorial to democratic, Dangerous because this process, fragile and vulnerable, could be hijacked by the communists and used for their own advantage. Suddenly that is already not so dangerous. People have hopes in these areas as well, because the Soviet involvement into international terrorism or international communist expansion is scaled down. We have good news all over. But it's not only an economic crisis, it's not only a bankruptcy. It is a political crisis, ideological crisis. It's a crisis of very idea, an idea of socialism. 200 years after it was conceived and 100 years after people tried to implement it, we came to an answer to these questions. No, there could be no productive form of socialism. And the inbuilt into socialist models, whatever type of model you take, inbuilt into it an extensive economic development just suddenly proved to be impossible in our world. Even one of the richest countries on earth, Russia, got bankrupted and exhausted by an attempt to develop in extensive manner. But in order to come from an extensive economy to an intensive one does mean that one must somehow reform the political system as well. It so happened that if you try to make people rewarded for their merits and talents and promote for their performance, then they would not join the Communist Party. And if you do not promote them for their talents and reward for their merits, then they would not perform. The crisis, as perceived in the Soviet Union, is exactly that, the structural crisis. How much of the role the Communist Party should and can play in the further development, and how much it could be curbed by the government which is trying to reform the system. It's paradoxical from the standpoint of a government, because the more they reduce the power of the Communist Party in the running economy, in day-to-day running economy, the more they reduce their own power. Gorbachev, after all, is only the General Secretary of the Communist Party. So by reducing the power of a party, he's reducing his own. He is, in a way, cutting a branch on which he sits. Therefore, one of the solutions, as I found it, was to involve people into this process more than before. Essentially, if we translate it from a Marxist jargon into human language, if you share the property, you should share power. That's what it boils down to. They do want a broader participation of the people, not only in economic development, but also in the governmental affairs. It is a retreat from a position of the absolute master, which Communist Party occupied for 72 years, into that of a senior partner. Still a senior partner, still the only one political party in the country, still the only one economic power, the ownership of means of production, as they say in Marxist language, still must remain in the state's hands. It is not supposed to be privately owned. But nevertheless, that is an orderly retreat, which allows them to somehow improve the performance and to stabilize the situation. You see a repetition of all this pattern all over. You see in Poland an attempt to deal with solidarity as a partner. You see in Hungary, the same attempt to find some kind of participation of the society in the affairs. That, of course, went much further than in the Soviet Union. In Hungary and in Poland, they are well ahead of us. What is in the Soviet Union is slightly more controlled and less free. And here I'm coming to a bad news. Contrary to a popular belief, Soviet Politburo did not suddenly convert to democracy. Contrary to what people think here, glasnost is not freedom of speech, and perestroika is not an attempt to introduce the market economy. No, it is still an old attempt to square a circle, to find one variety of socialism which might somehow work, hoping for a miracle. As for democratization, a popular joke in Moscow today is, what is the difference between democracy and democratization? Oh, it's as much a difference as between canals and canalization. So the bad news, of course, is that this attempt had already failed. The economic reforms did not produce the desired result. And the people, at the same time, the people use the opportunity given to them by slight openness to forward their own agenda. They are trying to square a circle, and no one hopes that it will produce any results in the economy. But at the same time, whatever given to them by a democratization, even limited as it is, suddenly brought forward questions like national independence of different nationalities in the Soviet Union, questions of human rights, questions of religious rights, and with all these questions suddenly became the most important. By the end of the last year, Soviet leaders already realized that their reforms will not produce desired result. Yet, political repercussions, the political consequences of it are already dangerous for their power, too dangerous for them to handle. Therefore, by the end of last year, they effectively suspended reforms. The most important parts of it, like the reform of price formation or convertibility of ruble, things or further decentralization, got postponed indefinitely. It's promised that they might be renewed in 1991, but who knows what will happen in 1991. But at the same time, the measures are taken by the Soviet regime to take back what is already given in political sense. We suddenly hear about clashes all over without a massacre in Georgia where hundreds of people were chopped with spades by Spetsnaz units and poisoned with gas. We suddenly hear about, we know about Armenian, how the Soviets tried to handle Armenian unrest and legitimate demand for independence. We do know that the tanks are already in Baltic countries. They are not used yet. During the daytime, the tanks are withdrawn from the cities, but by night they sometimes go into the cities. So it's just a moment, just a turning point, and we don't know when they will actually introduce a martial law there. Meanwhile, very little noticed in the West that the Soviet regime was preparing the martial law and other measures of repression throughout the fall of last year. They introduced a law extending extending to the army a power of police. They introduced law restricting freedom of demonstrations, freedom of press, and finally, just a couple of weeks ago, Gorbachev signed a new law, a new version of Article 70 and 190, the notorious articles under which we were all imprisoned. And this new version is actually worse than the one we had to serve under in the Soviet jails. It is worse. It is actually a death sentence to glasnost. If these articles are to be applied in the Soviet Union, they would practically have to arrest everyone, starting with Gorbachev himself, who signed that new law. And I can assure you that they are going to apply this article. They are trying now to reverse the process of democratization. We will hear more and more stories about clashes between the authorities and the people, and I can assure you that the people will not stop. There is no peaceful solution in this situation. I don't think that Soviet people would ever accept advice given by Mark Twain to American people that it's good to have constitutional freedoms and enough of common sense not to use them. I don't think that will ever happen. And whenever given half a chance, they will take it into their hands and press forward. Therefore, each time it has to be curbed. But at the same time, if the Soviet authorities want to make their model more productive, they do have to give people more initiative. So we are observing a kind of a cyclic development, a fluctuation between the tough phase and the liberal phase. In the liberal phase, there are attempts to improve economy, yet it starts the erosion of power structures in the Soviet Union. In the tough phase, it stops the erosion of power structure, but the economy suffers even further. In between these two is going to be a cyclic process for the next 15 years at least. There is a good news in this and bad news in this. The good news is that there will be some, in the periods of these cycles, there will be some moments when one or another nation in Eastern Europe or one or another nation even in the Soviet Union would have a chance to get out of it. I think that if the Soviets introduce martial law tomorrow and will use their army to calm down workers in Ural Mountains, they wouldn't have enough power to invade Hungary or to invade Poland at the same time. So there will be a chance in the period of turmoil for some nations to get out of it. Finally, unfortunately, at this time, we do not observe much of the help from the West. There is euphoria about the West, in the West about the Soviet Union. The whole Western world wants to support Gorbachev, forgetting about Democrats in the Soviet Union. They support the regime instead of supporting the people who already spoken. They want democracy. They don't want a socialist pluralism or whatever Gorbachev is trying to do. We suddenly have, in the worst possible moment, we suddenly have the West agreeing to hold a conference on human rights in Moscow, which came very badly timed, exactly at the time when the regime already went backwards, when already started introducing all this repressive law. In doing so, the West didn't even raise a question about Armenians, and at that time the whole Karabakh committee was already in jail, including even 2 members of Supreme Soviet. The Georgian massacre, we didn't have even concern expressed by any government in Europe or in the government of the United States, let alone a condemnation of this massacre. The impression I've got is that the West is very much confused. They are supporting the wrong side in this conflict. The conflict is inevitable, but they are on the wrong side of it. They do not realize that they have to and should strengthen the opposition in the Soviet Union. On the examples of other countries, including the example of Poland, we know that the stronger the opposition, the less bloody is the conflict between authorities and the people. The more organized the opposition, the more cohesive forces in the society, the better handled is the conflict. We don't have such a strong and well-organized opposition as Poles do. They had a lot of years to do that. They had Catholic Church, a very important cohesive force in the country which could unite the people. We don't have that soul. We are heading for a chaotic and very bloody conflict. And unless the West realizes that and gives much more support to oppositional forces, not to Gorbachev and his reformers from Politburo, we will see a terrible clash between the people and the regime. We will see a bloodshed in huge proportions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bukovski, for being blunt about the bad news as well as the good. We next hear from Janos Kish, who's in the West for a year teaching philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. Mr. Kish has actively participated in democratic opposition movements in Hungary since 1973. He is a founder of the journal Beszélő and of the Association of Free Democrats, working for the establishment of multi-party democracy in Hungary. Mr. Kish.
As somebody coming from a country facing now a transition problem, the problem of transition to democracy, I would like to talk to you about both the opportunities and the pitfalls lying in the present pre-transition situation. And as somebody not relaxed enough to speak freely to you, I have to beg your pardon and to read my text I prepared for this conference. The birth of democratic movements in Eastern Europe has taken place in the last 15 years, at the same time as authoritarian regimes of Southern Europe and Latin America have begun or completed their transition to democracy. The East European movements until now, however, stopped short of initiating a transformation of the political system itself. Their strategy was invariably limited to the reconstruction of civil society within the framework of the Communist Party's unchallenged control over the government and the coercive apparatuses. The era of such self-limitation appears to be closing now. In Poland and Hungary, power sharing and dissociation of the state from the Communist Party are real issues. Czechoslovakia may follow these two countries very soon. Both in Poland and in Hungary, it was the communist leadership itself which made the offer for opposition movements to be legally consolidated and to share in the government. I think it crucial to understand the motives and the meaning of this gesture. It would be misleading to interpret it as a repetition of the 1980 Gdańsk negotiations. At that time, Poland's communist leaders, pushed to the wall by a particularly vigorous strike movement, accepted the talks because they felt unprepared to exclude the opposition from the political arena by force. This time, however, they offered talks under much weaker pressure because they are interested in including the opposition into the power structure. By the end of this decade, the beginning of which was marked first by official recognition and then by the outlining of solidarity, both Polish and Hungarian communists have to recognize that there is no way for them to stabilize their regime in face of the ongoing economic crisis and social decay, without sharing the responsibility with partners who are really independent of them. For the first time since the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, ruling parties are in need of a legal opposition so that by co-opting it into the power structure they can use its authority to legitimize austerity measures and to demobilize social resistance. By joining the game, started by the offer of negotiations, both sides face tremendous risks. The danger for the communist leadership consists in the very real possibility that the process which was initiated by their offer leads much farther than they intend to go. The break opened up in the wall of the monocentric party-state system may progressively widen until the process achieves equilibrium in a truly competitive parliamentary democracy. This chance indeed provides the only justification for the democratic opposition to accept the bargain. But the opposition must face the danger that instead of initiating a relatively ordered transition to democracy, the deal may stabilize communist power or at least deprive the society of any credible opposition force. Being manipulated into the role of is not, however, the only risk opposition in Poland and in Hungary has to face. The transition process, even if it gets started, is not going to be a stable one. On both sides, the control which the parties to the contract exercise over the organizational basis will probably be subject to severe strains. Communist apparatchiks in strategic positions may try to upset the deal by sabotaging it or by stage managing outright provocations. Opposition radicals, on the other hand, may initiate a campaign to delegitimize the compromise made with the communists. The social contract may fall apart before it can produce any tangible results. Another danger threatening the transition process is connected with the economic crisis. Unavoidable austerity measures and continuing decay may convince the so-called silent majority that democratization is making the situation even worse. The opposition might be perceived as co-responsible for the accumulating hardships. Such a development could be seen by communist leaders as advantageous to them, because it would discredit any conceivable political alternative. It might result, indeed, in a more and more widespread longing after order and discipline, which would favor the appearance on the scene of a man of providence to save the fatherland from political and economic chaos. A chain reaction of spontaneous outbursts of mass violence could also result from the general delegitimation of all kinds of politics, official or unofficial. There are risks hidden in the international environment too. A new conservative stabilization in the Soviet Union, similar to that which the Brezhnev leadership was able to realize after Khrushchev's ousting, is not probable. Sharp oscillations in Soviet politics cannot be excluded, however, and these may easily destabilize the internal processes of change in Eastern European states. Ethnic and national conflicts may deflect public attention from the issue of democracy and might encourage authoritarian leaders to mobilize nationalist forces to consolidate their power, as in Serbia. These cursory remarks may give the impression that the chances for a peaceful, orderly transition to democracy in Eastern Europe are very slim indeed. Notice, however, that the present situation in Poland and Hungary does not result from just a chance opportunity. The Soviet Empire has entered the era of its decline and dissolution. Clearly, the Soviet state still has the military power to restore its dominance over the region by force. but it has exhausted its economic power to consolidate the order it would restore by force of arms. That is the main reason explaining why Soviet military intervention in Eastern Europe is becoming less and less probable. And that is the main reason explaining why economic decline and political unrest is spreading irrevocably through Eastern Europe. There is no other way to stabilize the region other than through the establishment of market economies and democratic political regimes. There is thus a reasonable hope that the dangers threatening the transition process can be overcome. But in order to succeed, we must carefully anticipate them. All the internal and external actors interested in a democratic transition should have a strategy of stabilizing the process. For the sake of brevity and using the privilege to speak here in Washington, let me focus my remarks on what, in my view, the Western governments could do. First, they have some leverage over accelerating the economic transition process and diminishing its social costs. A reduction of the debt burden, strangling both the Polish and the Hungarian economy, and maintaining in the case of Hungary, or resuming in the case of Poland, the credit flow seem to be absolutely necessary. I do not propose, however, a policy of continuing to pour easy money into the bottomless pit of our loss-producing economies. Debt should not be cancelled but partially transformed into industrial assets, free to be resold. Reprivatization should be encouraged. Creditors' consortiums should ask for the power of direct supervision. Extension of new credits might be tied to the condition that reprivatization goes ahead at a promising speed. As a guarantee for meaningful changes in the sphere of the economy, political pluralization should be linked to these issues. Second, the Ostpolitik, which consisted in cooperating with governments only, is to be rejected. But in cases where there is a significant chance for a negotiated transition, the Cold War attitude, which involved a complete rejection of serious talks with governments, should also be abandoned. What Western governments ought to support, in my view, is not one side against the other, but the making of a social contract between the two. This, however, must not mean abandoning the opposition to the goodwill of the so-called reformist wing of the Communist Party leadership. By recognizing the de facto pluralism of the political arena, Western governments could contribute to its consolidation and further development. Third, the time is ripe to change the perspective from which the West seems to look at the issue of peace and stability in Europe. One is accustomed to approach this issue as if it consisted of nothing but the problem of armaments. Actually, the asymmetry between NATO and the Warsaw Pact is not merely a matter of the imbalance of the military forces stationed on their territories. There is also an imbalance in organization. East European governments had to surrender, to a very large degree, control over their own armies to the Soviet High Command. Occupying Soviet troops move unchecked on Allied territories. There are no provisions excluding military threat or intervention from the relationships of the Warsaw Pact member states. Until this situation changes, the Warsaw Pact will remain an unpredictable and dangerous power factor in Europe. It is thus necessary to ask that Soviet troop withdrawals be accompanied by a reassertion of national sovereignty over national armies and territories within the Warsaw Pact, and by an explicit resignation by the Soviet Union of the use of force or of threats to influence internal processes in the Allied countries. The sooner this happens, the better the transition to democracy will be insulated from shocks caused by oscillations in Soviet policy. Finally, the West ought to firmly support the case of oppressed national minorities in Eastern Europe. Actions like the Serbian encroachment upon Kosovo's autonomy should not remain unanswered. Ceausescu must be isolated. His potential successors must be told that Romania won't be able to return to the community of civilized nations without democratization, which must include safeguarding and protecting minority rights. The alternative to such a firm policy is Balkanization, which in turn would justify attempts to re-establish Pax Sovietica over the region. But there is no way return to Pax Sovietica anymore, while Balkanization is not the only alternative to it. Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Kish, for a careful analysis of the risks of the transition process and a set of prescriptions for Western policy, which ought to receive a great deal of attention. We now turn to Willem Pritschan, who was a Czech historian who called for the restitution of historical truth in his country in the 1960s when he worked at the Institute of History of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. In '68, he co-edited the Czech Black Book, a collection of materials about the Soviet invasion and nonviolent popular resistance to it. He has since moved to West Germany, where he is the executive director of the Czechoslovak Documentation Center. Professor Pritschan.
Ladies and gentlemen, 140 years on, Marx and Engels' well-known pronouncement about Europe being haunted by the specter of communism requires some modification. Communist Europe is now haunted by the specter of democracy. Democracy is not only the key concept in the political vocabulary of those trying to solve the number one issue facing that part of the world, it is the irreversible transcendence of the Soviet-style totalitarian regime. It has become the most frequent expression in public speeches even of those who are trying to save the communist totalitarianism. The achievements and the prospects of democracy in Poland and Hungary were clearly described by my colleagues, Mr. Kuron and Kish. They are undeniable. But even in Czechoslovakia, which would seem to be a world leader in political inertia, and where the ruling political establishment continues to resist any idea of dialogue with society, and makes known in every possible way its opposition to any genuine shift or change, democracy's cards have been laid on the table. As one of the leading independent Czech commentators puts it, there is one thing we can be sure of. Things would be totally different here had our democratic political culture not been destroyed. Our only hope, if we are not to hit rock bottom, is to create it anew. It is the only idea that can lend meaning to our future. This idea was worked out into a political program in the Democracy for All manifesto, brought out in autumn 1988 by the Independent Movement for Civil Liberties in Czechoslovakia. Václav Havel, the country's greatest moral authority and one of the spiritual leaders of Czechoslovakia's democratic revolution, has called that manifesto the most important political card of 1988 as far as his country was concerned. For the fact is that the manifesto is an appeal for society to step into the political arena, seeing that the present rulers are unwilling to abandon their totalitarian style of government. The manifesto explicitly challenges the legitimacy of the so-called leading role of the Communist Party and asserts democratic pluralism as the fundamental political principle. This means, according to Havel, who was one of the manifesto signatories, that everyone has an equal right to compete for political power. Can this march of democracy come under the heading of democratic revolution? Is this term functional enough? I think it is, with the following provisos. Firstly, democratic revolution is used to describe the underlying trend of the times towards democracy, a system based on spiritual, political, and economic pluralism and mutual tolerance. Secondly, the democratic revolution has grown out of the gestation of elements of civil society which have gradually established themselves inside the totalitarian system, but which exist relatively independent of the totalitarian power structures. The democratic revolution commences the moment when that civil society advances the demand for changes in the system on the basis of democracy and freedom, and formulates a political program for achieving them. And thirdly, the democratic revolution is one of the least violent revolutions in history. Its advocates are opponents of violence and civil war. They are open to compromise and to ideas of national or social reconciliation. The democratic revolution of the 1980s has its historical forerunners, beginning from the Kronstadt Matinee of 1921. One distinguished antecedent, possibly the key initial step in the direction of the democratic revolution in the Soviet bloc, was the moral revolution, which served as the basis for the dissidents of the 1970s. The new concept of human rights emergent from the critique of communist totalitarianism, the cultivation of citizenship, the implementation of the principle of life in truth, independent culture, and samizdat. The democratic revolution we are now witnessing differs from its predecessors in that it is taking place in the period of the terminal crisis of communism, of the progressive decay and the deepening agony both of its system and of its dogma, to quote Zbigniew Brzezinski. The question is sometimes asked whether the reforms undertaken or planned by the present communist establishment are not in fact part of the democratic revolution. To my way of thinking, these are two phenomena which differ in many respects, particularly in terms of their aims, although they cannot be entirely separated from each other. The democratic revolution in the Soviet bloc in the 80s has its own authentic roots and sources of inspiration. It is not derived from any socialist ideology, nor from any discussion about socialism, whether true or false, unsullied or sullied, nor it is an offshoot of Gorbachevism, even though its dynamism is in different ways, depending on the country, indirectly influenced by it. The goal of the democratic revolution is not a further attempt to square the circle, to quote Mr. Bukovsky, it is to modernize the communist system. The aim is to do away with it once and for all. Democratic revolution is therefore nothing to do with a limited democratization, but with democracy. It does not advocate glasnost, but free speech. It counters the idea of socialist pluralism with a program of freedom, spiritual, political, and economic pluralism, and the emancipation of citizens and civil society from the state. The democratic revolution sources of inspirations are not primarily remembrance of a democratic past. It derives its legitimacy from the universal applicability of human rights, and it substantiates its arguments with an open analysis of the contemporary situation in the individual countries of the Soviet bloc. The democratic revolution is therefore also a reaction to those societies' 40 or more years' experience of communist totalitarianism, whether called socialism, existing socialism, socialism with a human face, or without. Equally, is it the outcome of the experience of prosperously functioning democratic systems in Europe and North America? In this respect, the global context has seen a positive change. The democratic ideal is now more favorable placed than at any time this century. The overall crisis of communism displays very specific characteristics in individual countries. As far as Czechoslovakia is concerned, it is fair to say that no communist party in any other country of the Soviet bloc ever managed to lose moral prestige, confidence, and legitimacy in the eyes of society to the same extent as the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. 20 years of normalization, according to Soviet instructions from the 1968-69 period, used it up well and truly. One might say that the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia has written itself off as a political force capable of generating an alternative to the present establishment. Apart from a small circle of people who still entertain 1968 vintage reformist illusions, no one in Czechoslovakia believes that the Communist Party is capable of any sort of renewal, or that it embodies any sort of hope for the future. Distrusted and rejected by society, particularly the younger generation, and lacking any intellectual base, it is not capable of following even the Soviet, Polish, or Hungarian examples. And whereas people, not so long ago they were called the silent majority, are losing their fear, the establishment is beginning to feel threatened. In the course of 1988, we witnessed more social movement in Czechoslovakia than at any time during the previous 20 years. The trend has continued non-stop. People's determination to assert their civil rights is manifesting itself in every possible way. Peaceful demonstrations and rallies that have taken place despite threats and in spite of the danger of police terror. The growth of independent citizens' initiatives, with petition after petition being launched since the beginning of this year. These have gained the signatures of thousands of people from the so-called official structures. In other words, the cultural, artistic, and academic establishment in support of people described by government leaders in parliament and in the mass media as provocateurs and enemies of socialism. This eruption of socialist activity in the form of civil disobedience is by no means economically motivated. It is, above all, people's reaction to 20 years of lies and humiliation and their own conformity. It is a chain reaction sparked off by a yearning for a healthy public life, for plain speaking, and for the undistorted truths about what everyone can see with their own eyes. The most actively involved are young people who find the official cliches and lies intolerable. There are no taboos as far as they are concerned. They are not burdened with ideology. They are well informed, since modern communications media open their horizons to the entire world. They have no sentimental attachment to socialism, and their past are no burden to them. They feel that it is their future, literally their whole lives, that is at stake. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that my time is over. I would need some 2.5 minutes to finish my conclusions.
Continue.
May I? In spite of all the optimism with which we may speak about the present democratic revolution, we remain skeptical. Things could still go wrong. There are numerous reasons for such doubts, and they have all been analyzed. No one can know just how far the metropolis of the Soviet Empire will be prepared to let democratic developments in Eastern Central Europe go. There is no way of estimating the price it will be prepared to pay at any given moment, which priority will prevail, which loss will be considered the lesser of two evils. But there is an even more fundamental question Mr. Bukovski spoke about. What are the chances of a democratic revolution in the Soviet Union itself, or more to the point, among the Russians themselves, caught in the throes of perestroika's insoluble dilemmas and their fevered pursuit of their own political identity? Will the Russians have the time or the opportunity to understand the demand for sovereignty of the nations of the external empire? The Soviet threat is not the only barrier to a victorious democratic revolution in the Eastern Central European countries. The communist regimes in those countries may well have come into existence as satellites of the Soviet superpower, but they keep themselves alive by their own efforts, using their own resources and in their own interest. The system, however, the system of power and the interests of the nomenclatura are not the only factors inhibiting the transformation of the communist system into a liberal democracy with a mixed economy. There are also the interests, attitudes, and fears of many of the ruled. In each of the countries in question, so many problems have accumulated, particularly in the economic sphere, that they appear virtually insurmountable. It is impossible to predict the role that might be played by the fears and uncertainties of the labor force, who will bear the main burden of consequences for overcoming economic stagnation and backwardness. They are now the majority of workers silent, still silent in Czechoslovakia. Fear of their possible reaction is a further source of inertia within the communist leadership. They are, of course, sources of hope. The greatest source of hope is, in my opinion, the progress made by civil society within the crisis-torn communist system, the spiritual, political, and professional emancipation of individuals and groups, new kinds of civic solidarity, the discovery of new forms of freedom of expression and organization. More and more capable and willing people are emerging from anonymity, and therein lies the true hope of the process of the democratic revolution. And them we have to help by all means we have at disposal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for one more complimentary and important analysis and statement of the process in which East Central Europe and the Soviet Union are engaged. We turn now to an American commentator. He has had 3 lives, one in Hungary, where he grew up, one as a very distinguished professor at the University of Berkeley, at the University of California in Berkeley, and now in the United States Congress as a Democratic member from California and co-chairman of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, Representative Tom Lantos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was one of the most stimulating hours that I have had in a long, long time. And I suspect while each of you, I too, have hours worth of commentary, I will need to be very brief and very much to the point. But there are certain things that stand out clearly. Number one, we are at the hinge of history. We are connected to the past, but we are swinging in new directions. And whether you personally agree with the voices of hope and optimism that we have heard, or the voices of doom, there is little doubt in the minds of any of us that this is an extraordinary moment in modern history. The phrase, the terminal crisis of communism, has rolled off everyone's lips as if it would be a given, and it may well be. Some of us are old enough to remember that not too many years ago, communism was paraded as the wave of the future, and not too many people were laughing. So the first thing I suspect we need to recognize, from the most optimistic views to the views of my good friend Vladimir Bukovski, with whom I spent last weekend listening to his voice of doom and gloom and realism, is that this is a hinge of history. And not many of us expected to be here when, in fact, the leader of the Soviet Union, almost on a weekly basis, announces the bankruptcy of his system. Some of us have been announcing the bankruptcy of the system for a long time. But it is delightful and refreshing to get confirmation from the head honcho, and it's a joy to hear him repeat it on every occasion, that the system just does not work. Maybe the system could never work, but there are a lot of people who paid a very heavy price for seeing to it that it does not work. And the four speakers we have just heard from played their own important role, and I think they deserve a hand from all of us for their contribution. I think the American labor movement deserves a lot of credit for keeping hope alive. And let me say a word, as one who votes on their budget, about the National Endowment for Democracy and its singularly able president, Karl Gershman. They have kept the hope alive. It doesn't speak too well of us that the last vote on the budget of the endowment was one of the closest votes imaginable. And it indicates that we have a tremendous job of education to do about the forces of democracy and the need of the forces of democracy for resources right here in the halls of Congress. Well, what does the government of the United States do with this avalanche of analytical, informative, insightful comments that we have just heard? It seems to me the formula for both our executive branch and for our Congress is clear. Most importantly, we have got to redouble our support for the truly democratic elements in all of these societies. There can be no compromise on that issue. The people who have put their lives on the line in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, need our dramatically intensified support, financial, political, diplomatic, economic, military, psychological, moral, in every conceivable way. Secondly, we have got to recognize that there is a new element in the leadership which, for reasons of its own, is prepared to make major compromises. It is my judgment that we have got to deal with this leadership. We have got to see to it, not that it stays in power for good, but as Mr. Kish indicated in his brilliant analysis, that it moves towards a social contract with civic society in the respective countries. This is not an unrealistic expectation. And despite the many dark clouds on the horizon of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it would be utterly unrealistic not to recognize how far we have come. All of us must be aware of the use of poison gas in Georgia. All of us must be aware of the fact that Havel, as we meet here this morning, is in jail. All of us must understand that the Ceausescu regime is more oppressive today than it has been during its undistinguished history. Yet, the achievements in a number of countries, particularly in Poland and in Hungary, are historic. The market economy and democratic political structures are being recognized increasingly as the only formula for survival. What we have here today is a group of people who know that we are the wave of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Congressman Lantos. Our opportunity now for discussion is going to be somewhat brief, but I remind you that there will be further opportunities on this subject tomorrow morning. So if you don't get to speak at this moment, please hold your fire. Yes, sir. Would you state your name, please?
Shandor Tarasovic. It's hard to find a question or idea that we heard from the opening remarks until the very excellent comments from Congressman Lantos. Still, I tried. I would like to address two questions, one to Mr. Kish and one to Mr. Bukovski. Mr. Kish, if I understood, said that the democratic movement began about 15 years ago. Now, if we say about the present movement, it probably so. But for the movement and the desire and actions for democracy, we can say began earlier. There was a mention of 1980, 81, 1968. We could mention 1956, 1953, actually from 1945 at least. I would like to ask Mr. Kish if you could reflect on it. Mr. Bukovski, if I understood him correctly, said that unfortunately we don't have enough help from the West. What does Mr. Bukovski think would be enough help in specific way? Up to this moment, the Western world stated many times that they are searching for ways to win the souls of the captive peoples. Now, apparently, we have their souls. What the West can do to win and secure their bodies for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Kish, and then Mr. Bukovski.
Well, I am absolutely conscious of the historical importance of the 1956 revolution as a tradition for the present. By the way, the time being one of the facts which contribute to destabilization of the regime in power is the revival of the memories of 1956. But I wanted to speak of those movements which are continuous from the beginning, and these movements started about the mid-70s. That was all.
Well, at the moment, the West does practically nothing for the democratic forces in the Soviet Union. They're all too much sort of euphoric and infatuated with Gorbachev and what he stands for without understanding the difference. Helping Gorbachev does not mean to help democracy, not at all. What do I want them to do? First of all, I would like them not to do certain things. First, not to give a human rights conference in Moscow in 1991, because it's insulting. I mean, why don't we talk about the human rights conference in Pretoria? No one would do that, would they? But when it comes to Soviet Union, we somehow want human rights conference there. Second, I would like the Western support, public support and governmental support to these forces. And whenever the government goes to the streets and slaughters people, at least, the least we can expect is a protest from the governments. Finally, when we talk about the more substantial support, we are all aware of billions of dollars being poured into Kremlin's coffers. And we all understand that this money are not going to help democracy. This money will be used to prop up the bankrupt Soviet regime. And if any result of this money coming to the Soviet government right now might be noticed, it is the opposite result. It helps them not to go into more radical reforms. The more they get money from the West, the less there is a need for them to go and, for much more radical and dangerous reforms. So I would rather be very strongly against this huge transfer of money to the Soviet government as opposed to the people. Well, why don't we have a nice law? Since we have a congressman with us this morning, why don't we have a law which will oblige anyone who gives credits to Soviet Union to give 10% of the same sum of money to the oppositional forces at the same time?
The comment speaks for itself. I appreciate, the chair appreciates the brevity of the questions so far and the conciseness of the answers. Let's try to keep it that way. Mr. Novak, I think you had a question. And I will need to repeat it afterwards for the sake of the translation if you need it.
I would like to address my question to two distinguished congressmen who are here. I told my old former boss and old friend, Mr. Richardson, that under impact of the mood in this room and the presence of the champions in the fight for democracy, that our old dream comes true, which is we witness the birth of democracy international. But at the same time, I cannot understand that we are prepared, and I think rightly so, to support offers humanitarian rights of $100 million to Nicaragua resistance movement, but at the same time, only less than $20 million to this instrument that we are prepared, rightly so, still rightly, to spend $250 million for one B bomber, but less than 10% for this instrument, National Endowment for Democracy. And I would like to ask you, is it not really the evidence that you are so hypnotized by the power of modern weaponry that we are really the victims of another Maginot Line and underestimate the power of ideas? And may I remind you that Lenin said that ideas are more dangerous than bullets?
Thank you for the eloquent question, which boiled down again to Mr. Lantos says, why are those people voting against the National Endowment for Democracy, and why isn't the budget tripled?
Well, I want to commend the gentleman for his question. Before I answer it, let me be sure that Vladimir Bukovsky fully understands that the Congress not only is not pouring billions of dollars into the Soviet Union, the Congress is not pouring 1 cent into the Soviet Union. What you do see is the embryonic beginnings of some joint ventures, most of them not from the United States, most of them from West Germany, as you know as well as I do. And as is obvious with respect to earlier business ventures, some of these will prove to be very unsuccessful. But I don't think there is much danger that, the Congress of the United States will vote economic aid for the Soviet Union in the foreseeable future. So lest anyone from the press misunderstood your point, we are not funding the Soviet Union. What we are talking about with respect to Hungary and Poland, something that I very strongly support, is the creation of the kind of economic climate and the kinds of economic provisions that will enable these two countries to stand on their own feet economically. We are talking about extending most favored nation treatment on a multi-year basis. As you recall, last year I introduced unsuccessfully a provision that would have provided for the insurance of American investment in Hungary. I will again do so, have done so, for both Hungary and Poland. I think it's important we help Hungary and Poland to renegotiate their debts. I think it's extremely important we try to move in with some joint ventures. My feeling also is, and I'm not here to adjudicate between Secretary Cheney, my former colleague and good friend, and the President, as to whether Gorbachev will survive in the Soviet Union or not, but whether he does or he does not, I am very anxious to use every minute in Hungary and Poland to create the kinds of conditions that will make the reintroduction of a repressive regime less likely, that will make the reintroduction of Soviet tanks less likely. So I think we may have a relatively short window of opportunity. If the pessimists are correct, we should do our utmost to move to create improvements in Polish and Hungarian economic conditions and in establishing institutions that will be able to withstand the backlash which is surely to come. With respect to enhancing the budget of the National Endowment, you are certainly talking to the converted. I will be delighted to do so. I think these are the best tax dollars that we spend these days.
We have a 1-minute question, please, only. I'm sorry, but we're just coming to closing time.
My name is Andrzej Pomian. I represent Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences in New York. I address the question to Mr. Kurel. Isn't it really true that rationalization you gave for evolution in Poland, for choosing evolutionary method of acting, isn't it true that the real reason is the lack of naked force? Regime's got a force and double force, as a matter of fact. It's on and outside Soviet force. We don't have that force, naked force, despite the support of population. Isn't therefore advisable to do one thing? Not only place all your hope on evolution, but to try to weaken armed force in Poland. After all, change in the revolution begins when soldiers refuse to shoot, or if they shoot at their officer.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Pomian asks if, given the monopoly of force in the ruling group in Poland, isn't it right for the opposition and for others in Poland to find ways to weaken that force? Mr. Kuron.
I'm sorry, I'm still translating.
Okay.
Jeśli chodzi o to, że żołnierze mają odmówić strzelania, to prawda jest taka, że najpóźniej dezintegruje się wojsko na poziomie batalionu albo kompanii.
As far as the refusal to shoot by the soldiers, the truth is that the armed force disintegrates at the last moment at a level of a battalion or a company.
A żeby zniszczyć bezbronnych Polaków, wystarczy parę batalionów wojska bądź polskiego, bądź sowieckiego.
And to destroy unarmed Poles, a few battalions of Polish or Soviet troops would be enough.
Myślę sobie, że problem nie polega na tym, czy oni będą od nas silniejsi zbrojnie, bo są, tylko na tym, czy proces organizowania się społeczeństwa sprawi, że po stronie obozu rządowego znajdą się, umocnią się takie siły, które będą chciały procesu reform, a nie chciały wystąpienia zbrojnego.
I don't think the problem is whether we will have a larger armed force than the government. The fact is the government has it, we don't. The problem consists of promoting such a process of political change under which in the camp of the government, on the government side, the influence of those who do not want to shoot would be enhanced.
Ja bym chciał na marginesie całej i tego pytania, i całej tej naszej rozmowy dzisiejszej przestrzec przed czymś, co nazwałbym szczególnym rasizmem ideologicznym.
I would like to warn you in the context of what was said today, warn you about the danger of something which I would call ideological racism.
To jest taki pomysł, że są jacyś komuniści, oni są komuniści. To jest ich cecha osoby, bytu niejako. I przeciw nim są inni, którzy też mają takie jakieś cechy sprawiające, że są dobrzy, a tamci są źli.
The whole idea is that there are some communists somewhere which immanently are communists and have all bad characteristics immanently. On the other side are good guys who immanently have all good characteristics.
Oczywiście nieprawda.
Which of course is not true.
I ja już nie będę mówił o tych wszystkich, co naprzód byli komunistami, a potem poszli do więzień przeciw komunistom, do których ja się zaliczam.
I wouldn't even mention those who used to be communists and then went to jail because they protested against communist policies. And myself, I'm one of these.
Bo to jest jakby mniej istotne.
Because it's less relevant.
Chciał powiedzieć, że mam taką wiarę, że wszyscy ludzie w gruncie rzeczy chcieliby dobrze, gdyby mogli.
I believe that generally all people have goodwill if it could be true.
Tylko warunki mamy parszywe.
Only the conditions are not conducive to implementation of goodwill.
Wszyscy, w Ameryce też.
Here in America as well.
Tylko u nas gorsze oczywiście.
But in our situation much worse, of course. Or in the Soviet Union.
I chodzi o to, aby te warunki zmieniać tak, aby ludziom łatwiej było być dobrymi. I wtedy będzie się wszystko zmieniać.
The real issue is to change the condition to make for the people easier to be good.
Rzecz w tym, że nie walczymy z ludźmi, tylko z systemem.
We don't fight the people, we fight the system.
Nie ludzie przeciw ludziom, tylko ludzie przeciw systemowi, który jest zły, który jest w istocie swojej grzeszny, powiedzmy.
Not people against people, but people against the system. A system which is bad, which basically is sinful.
That is a fitting final answer for this period and this panel. I think the audience here owes each of the panelists a vote of thanks, and you have... If people, will you stand in place, please?
Yes.
Stand in place, and we have only just a couple of minutes while the panels change.
Very well.
Join us for more coverage of this conference sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy today.